Okay, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Jeff Nippard podcast. In this episode, I'm speaking with IFBB pro John Meadows, and we're going to be talking about how hard it is we should be training in the gym. Now, this is going to be part 2 of a 5-part podcast series that I'm doing on this exact question. And I should say that when I set out to do this, I had originally just planned to get, a 3, maybe 4 or 5 minute answer from each of the experts that I interviewed and then kind of compile their answers for a YouTube video. But after each of these calls had started, I just couldn't help but ask some follow-up questions and realized that to really have each expert do this topic any justice at all, I would have to ask some follow-up questions and kind of dig into the details a little bit more. So what I decided I'd do is after I released that YouTube video, which I'll link down below, I would just do a full-blown interview with each of these guests and release them separately here on my podcast. So no doubt this will probably seem like overkill to some of you guys, and there's going to be 3 more podcasts like this on the way. But I think as you'll see, each guest has a slightly different slant to this topic, and I picked these guests specifically because I knew that they would disagree or at least offer different opinions on some of the details. So I think that you guys will find it interesting. And I think as you'll also see, we don't only stick to the topic of how hard you should train. We also kind of touch on the peripheral issues as well, which I find equally interesting and informative. So without further ado, I give you guys IFBB pro John Meadows. So John, how hard should we be training in the gym?
How hard should we be training in the gym? I think everybody should do like 50 drop sets a week, 25 sets of iso holds after the drop set, 32 cluster sets, and train your whole body daily using that methodology.
This is giving me flashbacks right now.
Well, you get up about 8 a.m., you have a bowl of oatmeal for breakfast, and then you train until 6 p.m., and then after that you have some steak and rice, and you call it a day.
That's right.
So, but seriously, I think the first thing you got to ask when you think about that is the experience of the trainee. So I look at it kind of like 3 levels. You kind of have this beginner level that could be 6 months, it could be 2 years, it could be somewhere around there. Then you kind of get your, we'll say motor patterns down. You just kind of learn how to train, you learn how to feel movements, and you move into this intermediate stage and you get better. You push a little bit harder, get a little better, and then you realize, after, another year or 2, maybe, depending on how sharp you are and, how much you push and how much you learn, then you kind of enter into this phase, this advanced phase, where you realize doing all those things that worked as a beginner and as an intermediate no longer work anymore, and you got to kind of reevaluate what your strategy is moving forward. So let me start with kind of the first of those 3. So when you start training, I think everybody would probably agree on this. I think we all realize that you don't have to kill yourself. Like, you don't need to take sets to failure. You don't need a crazy high amount of volume. Like, you just don't need that. You get what, we've always called newbie gains from the beginning, where your nervous system gets better and better talking to your muscles, and oh man, I can feel that bicep now when I'm doing a curl. And you get better compound movements. You start to get more coordinated, muscles working together when you're doing compound movements. So you just kind of get better just from doing the activity. Just by learning proper form, you can generally get stronger. As I mentioned, you don't even really need to take anything to failure. You just continue to get stronger and stronger. You make nice little incremental increases in strength, which down the road will lead to increases in size, but that's not necessarily initially, just because it's more nervous system related. But that only take you so far. Wouldn't it be great if that's how training was all the time? You could just kind of add 10 pounds on the bar for the rest of your life, and then by the time you're 60 years old, you could bench 1,200 pounds. But that's just not how it works. And so you kind of move into an intermediate stage where it's like, okay, now I feel most of these movements pretty good. It's not as easy to get as strong now. Now I probably need to push a little bit harder. And, one thing I didn't mention in that initial phase is I actually like to do higher frequencies. I like to touch the body parts more often. And that's where, I know you're a big fan of full body training. That's where I think it can be really impressive because let's say you train Monday, Wednesday, and Friday full body, and let's say you're doing a different exercise. You do one on Monday, one on Wednesday, one on Friday. So you can use 3 exercises for the week, and you rotate that the following week, or you do the same thing the following week, so you get better. So let's say you do an incline barbell press on Mondays. So week 2 you'll get a little stronger. Week 3 you'll get a little stronger. Week 4 you'll get a little stronger. And then on Wednesday maybe you do, I don't know, maybe you do a some kind of fly, a machine fly. Same thing, but it's given you more opportunities per week to feel the body part working. That's why the old bodybuilding 1 time a week stuff, I think, is probably a pretty poor choice for beginners. It's a real poor choice. So then you kind of move into that intermediate stage where it's like, okay, now I'm going to add a little bit of volume. I'm going to add a little bit of intensity. So now maybe it's not good to train 3, 4, 5 days a week. A full body, you could do 3, 4, 5 days a week. You've done the 5 days a week very well. So, but when you get to the intermediate one now, it's like, okay, now I want to include a second exercise. I really like, training different body parts. I'm really into this weightlifting thing now. Let me do a little bit more. So you add a little bit more volume, a little bit more intensity, and you can kind of bring down the frequency a little. So now, instead of hitting something 3 to 5 times, maybe you're hitting it, maybe say 2, 3 times. That's where I really enjoy like an upper lower split. I think is a good split. And so the question becomes then, okay, I'm doing a little bit more in volume. That's a little bit more workload. Now, what about intensity? So I might take an occasional set to failure now on the right kind of exercise. So obviously it wouldn't be on like a squat. I wouldn't want somebody to get in the squat rack and, okay, do it until you fail. That's probably not a good idea. Yeah. It's a good way to get smashed is what it's good for. So you pick the right exercises, and now you can take a couple sets to failure. Maybe on the 2 exercises you do, maybe you take 1 to failure during one of the sessions, and then later in the week when you hit the body part again, you go to failure again. The primary goal at that phase, I think, is still trying to get a little bit stronger, though. It's just because you've kind of went out of that newbie gain phase, it doesn't mean all of a sudden now you don't care about progressing your lifts. So you still maintain that focus as well. So you've got a little bit more volume, you got a little bit more intensity, but you're also still using that fundamental goal of getting a little stronger, trying to improve your lifts. And I think it's important to continue to work on your form. You get a guy like you and I, we've been training for a long time, but even we still try to work on our form. So it doesn't mean that you all of a sudden stop thinking about your form and things like that. So, you're going to kind of go down that road for, who knows, depending on how sharp you are, maybe another year, 2 years. Then all of a sudden you get to the gym and now the strength gains aren't coming in like crazy. Like now all of a sudden it's like, oh man, now I got to really work for my gains. And that's the part that becomes very tricky. And I think, Jeff, that's where most guys, they kind of die in their bodybuilding career. I don't mean like actual competitive bodybuilders. I mean people that go to the gym. That's where they kind of die because they had this methodology that got them great strength gains. They got some nice size. And so they became believers in that. Like, this is what works, but your body adapts and get closer to their genetic potential. So now it's like they can't give that up because it's what's worked before. And you have to have the intelligence to kind of say, okay, now I need to reevaluate this. Now what can I do to continue to progress? And I think that's where most people just kind of die with their bodybuilding. That's why they don't hit their genetic potential, right? So you get to this advanced stage. Now, this is where there's, quite a bit of research on, I don't want to bore everybody on this, but obviously on the amount of sets you do every week, 10 to 20 sets a week is about right, which I do agree with. But now all of a sudden you've got to challenge your body more. So some of those techniques that we like to use, an occasional cluster set and an occasional drop set, maybe you start putting one of those in a workout. Going back to our chest example, now maybe you get on a machine and now maybe do a cluster set to finish your day, or maybe you do a drop set to finish your day, something to really challenge the muscle. You can benefit a lot from those techniques just because it's just simply more intensity. It's more mechanical loading. You know, when you get to, I always hesitate in saying this, but I really believe it. So you're probably going to get a lot of people that get really angry at me for saying this, but I think that when you hit an advanced stage, I think you could literally use any exercises you want in any order you want, as long as those exercises work for you, as long as you just take them a certain amount of them to failure or failure and beyond. Because if you just look at muscle growth, it's mechanical tension. Okay, if you're using an exercise that gives you mechanical tension, you're probably going to grow. Now, you want good activation. So one of two things has to happen. You either need a weight that's heavy enough, probably 85% of your 1 rep max, something like that you're working with to get good activation. Or if you're using a lighter load, you're going to need to get closer to failure. We all know that. We keep hearing that. It's beaten into our brains. So you get activation, and then you get mechanical tension because you're working through it, close to failure, what have you. But then there's the third piece of this, and this is where bodybuilders actually do a really good job. Then you've got to kind of exhaust the muscle fibers. You've got to really challenge them. So that's where you do those tests to failure or beyond failure. And that's where you see the advanced guys can sometimes use those techniques to do really, really well, in particular naturals. Mm-hmm. The drug-aided guys have a lot of chemicals that can help them continue to break through plateaus, but the natural guys in particular, if they can kind of sprinkle some of that stuff in, it's really good for them to continue to grow. So again, back to what I was saying, it doesn't really matter what exercise it is, as long as it's one that you feel working well, and as long as you get good activation, good mechanical tension, and exhausting the muscle fibers. Like if you're doing those three things, what else are you going to do to make a muscle grow? Like that's what muscle growth is. Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes we like to laugh and giggle about, oh, you're changing exercises too much. I look at it this way. Do you have to change them? No, you just have to find exercises that work really well for you, and you have to push them hard. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, that's really kind of the crux of it. You find an exercise that works well for you, mm-hmm. and you just push it hard. And then you find another exercise that works well for you, and you just push it hard. And that's kind of the essence of the advanced stuff. Mm-hmm. It's learning how to get the right exercise and push them really hard. But you don't know that at the beginning. Because at the beginning, you're still trying to learn for them, and you're still trying to learn what exercises work best for you. Mm-hmm. You may not know at that point, mm-hmm. And then we have situations where maybe a movement never didn't feel good, but now maybe you've gotten so much better at training, all of a sudden that movement feels good all of a sudden. Like, wow, first couple of years, I never even felt these, but now these feel amazing. So, well, I'm talking a lot, so I'll slow down a little bit here. I want to ask some questions.
I'm going on and on. No, that was really interesting. So I'm just going to wrap my thoughts around it first and then maybe give you a follow-up question. But that was like a really, I think, good explanation. I like how you broke it down from like beginner to intermediate to advanced. So what you're basically saying is like, I think as a beginner, you actually don't need to push yourself as hard because you can grow just from getting accustomed to these movements very easily. As you get more intermediate, you're going to need to push it a little harder and probably bring the frequency back a little bit. Then as you get more advanced, now's the time that you really got to actually push it the hardest, and you can start incorporating more of these like advanced intensity techniques where maybe you're doing like a drop set or even going beyond failure with like a strip set or something like that. Is that like, if we just isolate the intensity part, would you say that's about right? Like the more advanced you get, the harder you should be going.
I would say. Yeah, that's exactly what I would say, Jeff. And I would say that then it becomes you just got to be good at knowing how much of that to do because you can overdo it. And then the other thing I would say is that's a broad thought right there. There's other ways to attack this. Like if you really like doing one exercise a body part, then you could keep your frequency up. And what I try to tell people when you're thinking about like frequency and intensity and volume and all those things, you know what really matters the most? It's just, are you recovered when you do your next workout? Like if you trained your legs, I don't care if you believe in training your legs once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, 5 times a week. What really matters is, are you recovered when you train again? Because I think probably one of the biggest mistakes you can make is being so gung-ho on frequency that you train something before it's even recovered. And that's a good way to overtrain muscle groups. The muscle fibers are damaged. They can't even produce as much force. So you're already kind of setting yourself back. And then the other side of that is waiting too long, particularly for naturals. Like if you train legs on Monday and they feel great on Wednesday, then why would you wait till the next Monday? Like that's just too much time. Right. And I think people generally understand that. But I do like to point out when you're like looking for this optimal frequency, optimal this, you got to recover. So
Right.
no matter what you think is right for you, just make sure you recover. And when you're recovered, hit the body part again. And then again, based on your level, where you at, that's what's going to dictate how much intensity you put into it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm just curious your thoughts on this. So some people would say that as you get more advanced, and I just want your honest take on this, as you get more advanced, you actually need to be more careful with failure because having more training volume is more important. So you're left with this choice. It's like, do I train really hard because then you might not be able to do as much volume, or do you train a little less hard so you can push the volume higher as you get more advanced? So it seems like you've got some people who are putting intensity a little ranked a little higher than volume. It's like it'd be better to push yourself a little harder and do a little less volume. Or is it better to push yourself a little less hard so you can do that extra volume? Which one do you put slightly ahead of the other, if any?
That's an awesome question. And, so first of all, I think about how we count volume. So, I can tell somebody, okay, I want you to do 3 sets of dumbbell presses, working your way up. Then on your 4th set, I want you to go to failure. And some people would say, okay, he just did 4 sets there. Some people would say, well, no, only his last 2 really were sets. Some people would say, well, only his last set was volume. So the first thing you got to realize is what's actual volume. Now, I will say this. I think in my younger years, I made some mistakes in my volume. And I think what I did, Jeff, was I'm going to use a leg press as an example. I would do
Just it's all good. Just wait 2 seconds. I'll cut
I'm
that
going
out.
to. So let me give you an example like with a leg press.
Yeah.
I used to do 1 plate aside for 10 reps, 2 plates aside for 10 reps, and so on all the way up to my top set. So let's say it was 10 plates aside for 10 reps. And that's a lot of volume. It's a lot of reps. Now, are they all really working sets? No, but that's still a lot of sets. By the time I got to the last set, that's quite a bit. So now if I were to do that, what I would do is I would do one plate for maybe 15, 20 reps, 2 plates for 15, 20 reps. And then the 3, 4, 5, and 6 plates would be for 3 or 4 reps. It's just to let yourself, I call them feeder sets. It's just to get you to your top set. And that's the set you got to go really hard on as you get more advanced. So that I would personally consider to be a little bit more on the lower volume side and higher intensity. But that's just one example. I may come into the gym and I may go, you know what? I just don't have it today. I can't go all out, bizarro, crazy, psycho. I think I'm just going to do 3 sets of 8, maybe not hit failure, but come close. Leave a little bit in the tank. I don't think either approach is a bad approach. I just think you got to be getting somewhere near failure. I don't think it's beneficial to go, man, I'm going to take every single set to failure. But I also have a really hard time believing that you can continue to improve if you don't even challenge yourself enough to even go to failure. Mm-hmm. Like there is a point where if you're leaving reps in a tank, your gains are going to stall. Mm-hmm. Like you haven't pushed yourself. Mm-hmm. And if you think you're leaving 2 or 3 reps in the tank, who knows, Jeff? Maybe you're leaving 4. Maybe you're leaving 5.
Yeah, I think that's the problem with that is a lot of people in my coaching experience and just, I'll pick a random guy and go to the gym with him, have a workout with him. And I see what he's calling an RPE 7 or 8. And I'm like, I'm sorry, dude, like that's not it. And he'll go through the workout with me and be like, oh my goodness, like, on paper that looks so easy. But when you actually do it with the appropriate intensity, it's a whole different story. For me, I think that intensity almost has to come first because you could do the most optimized volume imaginable, right? So like you got the perfect number, 22 sets for back, whatever it is, right? But if there's no intensity, you're not going to grow well, right? But if you strip a lot of those sets down and just do really hard work on those couple of sets and make them really count with good technique and good intensity, I think you'll grow a lot better. So I think that has to be the first rung of the ladder that you get to. And then it's like, okay, now let's set our volume right. But if you set your volume perfectly and you don't have the appropriate intensity, I don't think that volume is going to work for you. That's kind of the way that I think about it.
I 1,000% agree.
Yeah.
In fact, I would even go so far as to say it should be common sense.
Yeah.
But again, that's more for people who I think are a little bit more advanced. They
Mhm.
got several years under their belt. But I do have a hard time believing, to your point, that some of these RP sevens or eights are really sevens or eights. And again, you get what's really ironic to me is you get people that say, okay, I believe in progressive overload. I believe in adding this and adding that. Well, that's great. But if you're never taking anything to failure, can you actually tell me that was straight look in your face? Like you're
Mhm.
lying.
Yeah, yeah. This is
If you
probably a
think
good.
about that fundamentally,
Yeah.
that you're trying to improve, but you never even come close to failure, you're essentially lying
Uh huh. It's
because
all.
one thing says one thing and the other says the other.
It's also something I've termed fake progressive overload. So it's like you might have spent 2 months gradually working your way up, right? So if you're on a cable, you did 10 pounds, then you did 15 pounds, then you did 20 pounds, then you did 25. It's like, okay, you spent 4 weeks overloading in that way, but you could have just jumped straight to 25 and done away with all that. So it's not real overload,
Yeah, that's
right?
not
So,
true overload.
so I think
Yeah.
that, yeah, there has to be a requisite level of intensity or effort to begin with, and then you load from there. And in my view, that doesn't have to be necessarily RPE 10 all out, but it's got to be pretty close.
Yeah.
That's what I would
Yeah.
say.
And I think that's when you get into the nuances, like with the exercises you're doing.
Yeah.
If I don't like to see, I've said it on many occasions, I don't like to see bench presses done to failure. I don't like to see squats done to failure because I think that extra rep puts you look at risk versus reward, you look at injuries. I think you're asking for trouble. But if let's say it's a dumbbell press, heck yeah, man, you could take a set to failure, drop the dumbbells, and you're done.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that's when you start looking at, okay, now what exercises does it make the most sense to go to failure on, to use those high intensity techniques, um, which is kind of another level of programming in itself.
Mm-hmm. So there's two other things I wanted to talk to you about really briefly. What do you think of this idea? Because, well, I won't say what I think. What do you think of the idea that going to failure is very fatiguing? Because I personally don't think that. I think it personally really depends on the exercise. Like for me, a set of lateral raises to failure is it feels like nothing really,
Mm-hmm.
whereas a set of deadlifts to failure feels like I'm going to die. So
Mm-hmm.
it really like how hard you go and how hard that feels really does depend on the exercise. Like I'm guessing that you agree with this, but I just kind of would like your thoughts on that that difference. It's like I think that making a big deal out of training to failure is totally dependent on what movement you're talking about. Because for me, doing a bicep curl to failure is like, it's kind of hard, but it's not that hard. Whereas,
Yeah.
yeah, like I said, a squat or a deadlift to failure is brutal. So it really just depends.
Well, when you said that, the first thing that came to my mind is arm training. So, like when I do arms, I usually do 9 sets for bis and maybe 10 or 11 for tries, and every set's a failure. But it's arm training, man. It's push downs and curls, right? Like I do the set, and then 10 seconds later, I'm like, okay, you're ready to go again. But if I'm doing, say, legs, if I do, 4 exercises, I'm going to do maybe 3 sets to failure, to real failure. Maybe 4, but probably only 3 because, again, the exercise selection. So that's got to be taken into consideration too, for sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then what was the last thing? Oh yeah, okay. And then I'll briefly get your thoughts on going beyond failure. Like, we've talked about like, should you train hard? How hard should you train? Where do you put those? Let's just assume someone's pretty intermediate to advanced already. How often are you programming in beyond failure work?
I like to do, generally speaking, 2 of those sets in a workout. So let's say I'm doing what I do today. So today I did chest and shoulders. So the compound movement, I didn't go beyond failure. And then I was doing a prime machine, and I did a cluster set. So that's kind of a beyond failure. You go to failure, you stop for 20 seconds. You go to failure, stop 20 seconds. And then I went to the machine fly, and I did a drop set. So I did like 2 normal sets and then a drop set. So I did two I pick two exercises to do that on. I generally like that. I generally like to finish with like two exercises where you go beyond failure. The only time I don't do that is maybe I'm in a phase where I'm just a little burnt out. I want to pull back a little. And when that's the case, I don't take anything to failure for a couple weeks. But generally, I like to do that on two exercises.
Gotcha. So 2 exercises per workout to failure and maybe slightly beyond.
And you know what's amazing is 1 or 2 sets like that can make such a difference. Like I think about just different body parts through the years, and my hamstrings jump out at me. I remember when I stopped doing the traditional 3 sets of 10 on hamstring curls and then 3 sets of 8 to 10 on stiff-legged deadlifts. I remember when I started going hard on those leg curls, I remember how my hamstrings, like immediately for the first time in years, started growing. Like, oh, wow. And so what I would say too is I think that 1 or 2 sets can be incredibly productive. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it can be really productive. You could get into the whys and all that stuff. But I just in general think that those sets are very, very underrated. I think it's a double-edged sword too, though. They're so effective, but if you try to do 3 of them, 4 of them, 5 of them, 6 of them, now all of a sudden you're impeding that recovery. You're making it so hard to recover. So you got to kind of find what can you recover from in a decent amount of time. But I just think, I know a lot of people don't think that those kind of sets make any sense. But for me and a lot of the people I've worked with, and particularly a lot of the natural guys, man, those sets make a big, big difference.
I can see that. They also just, even psychologically, remind you of what it's like to actually push yourself hard. And then that can be a benchmark for the work where you're not going quite as hard. Because if you never test it, then it's hard to know how much you're actually leaving in the tank. So having those sets where you truly go all out, then you can be like, okay, well, let me compare the RP 7 or 8 set to that all out set, because that's really what all out is, right? And then it gives you some reference to guide yourself by.
And not only that, it's fun.
That too. Yeah.
Like that stuff's fun, man. It's like, right. Okay, let's unleash, let's go nuts, let's have a good time. Like those are fun. I enjoy them.
Yeah, me too. All right, John, that was more than enough, honestly. We got a half hour here, so I thought that was an awesome answer. I feel like a lot of people will really get a lot of value out of that. So that's all I've got for you, man.
Okay. All right.
Easy.
I'll crawl back in my hole now.